Hello, world, and welcome to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterland, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is episode 84. Summer is winding to an end, and this week's episode is going to kick off with a look back at one of the most popular summer activities of my childhood and a lot of people's childhoods. That is the drive-in, specifically Cape Cod's drive-ins. We're going to take a road trip to the bayside town of Bristol in the smallest state of Rhode Island. We're going to go way, way back in the day and look at what it was like to get all of those records or CDs for 1 cent from Columbia House. There's going to be a brand new top 5 that are the top 5 brand names that are synonymous with their product. And of course, there'll be a brand new This Week in History and Time Capsule, all coming up right now on episode 84 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Welcome in, everybody. I know for a lot of people, summer is over. You've gone back to school, back to work if you're a teacher. And even though Labor Day is the unofficial end of summer, it's still not over yet. At the recording of this podcast, when it goes live, there'll be about 2 weeks left of summer. I find it funny when I see people talking about the weather and weather reports in September with, oh my God, the weather's hot. It's like it's still summer until the 3rd week of September. What did you expect? It's like the people that are shocked that we get snow in March. It's still winter until near the end of March. But for those of you whose summer is over, how was your summer? Did you get to do everything you wanted? Did you make lots of fun memories? I know there is kind of a pressure to get some kind of fun memory in during summer. That's why I think the last week of August, or the last week before Labor Day, whenever that is that mad dash to get into vacation where people realize, oh my God, we haven't gone on vacation yet. We got to do it now. That was when I ended up taking my vacation, was the last week of August. Mostly at my boss's request. If I had had my way, I'd have taken my vacation sometime in November, closer to my birthday. I know I had said I was going on this big long road trip around northern New England. It just ended up every place to rent, there was either no rooms available or it was severely overpriced. And I thought to myself, why am I going to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars when I could just do a couple of day trips during the week vacation and it would be the same fun? And it was. I'm easy to please. But for those of you that didn't get to have your vacation, or those of you whose summer is over, I'll try to give you some warm memories and flashbacks with this week's episode. I have to, as always, say thank you to everybody who's been tuning in. Like I said last week, August ended up being my 3rd month in a row that was the highest for downloads for the podcast. And that's such a great feeling. It really makes me excited to keep going with these. My goal when I first started was to get to 100 episodes. And here I am at 84, and I really think I'm going to go further than that, but we'll see. But just you all sharing, leaving reviews, donating if you can, but sharing if you can't, all gives me the feeling that I'm going to go further than 100 episodes. But let's dive into some warm summer memories as we take a look back at the dawning of the drive-in, and then more specifically, Cape Cod's old drive-ins. Children of the 80s, get ready as we kick off episode 84 of the In My Footsteps podcast. The drive-in movie theater was at one time a staple of American life. Being able to enjoy a film on a large outdoor screen from the luxury of inside your own car was a cherished memory for so many over several decades. Even though in 2022 there are only approximately 320 remaining drive-ins in the country, there are still some classic drive-ins left. On Cape Cod for so long, the Wellfleet Drive-In was the last remaining vestige of a bygone era. However, that changed briefly in the summer of 2020 when the former Yarmouth Drive-In was brought back to life more than 3 decades after initially closing. The story of the drive-in theater is long and storied and intertwined with Cape Cod. Though there were drive-ins of a sort as far back as the 1910s, the first true patented drive-in theater debuted on June 6, 1933. The first proper drive-in theater was the brainchild of Richard Hollingshead. He took the existing idea of watching silent films outdoors on screens and added the ability for the wildly popular automobile to become a part of it. Hollingshead opened his creation in Camden, New Jersey, with a showing of the British comedy Wives Beware. Tickets cost 25 cents per person and also 25 cents per vehicle. The Camden Drive-In had a capacity of 400 cars, and 600 people attended that first night's showing. His investment of $30,000, or about $683,000 when adjusted for inflation, spawned a new industry that would sweep the nation. Though primitive in the beginning, including not having the individual speakers for cars, the drive-in slowly began to catch on. In January 1938, plans were discussed for a potential drive-in near the Barnstable Airport in Hyannis on Cape Cod. These discussions were brief, as the potential of such an attraction was not seen as being an asset to Cape Cod at the time. By the end of the 1930s, there were 18 drive-ins located in America. These included 4 in Massachusetts in the towns of Weymouth, Lynn, Shrewsbury, and Methuen. In 1948, that number had leapt up to 820 total theaters, and it was around this time that the drive-in was finally seen as a worthwhile investment for Cape Cod. In May 1949, building contractor Louis Singrini of Mansfield, Massachusetts, was granted a permit to build the first drive-in on Cape Cod. This drive-in would be far more than a place to watch movies in your car, though. The 70-acre plot, located on Holcomb Rock Road in Dennis, near Route 134, was at the time the largest drive-in in New England. It had a capacity of 1,000 cars and would also become the first fly-in theater. And this distinction came from the fact that small airplanes and helicopters could land on a strip near the back end of the grounds, taxi their way to spots to watch the movies from inside the plane. In addition to being the largest theater and a fly-in theater, the Dennis Drive-In included a dance pavilion, bottle warming service for young mothers, refreshment stands, and even 20 cottages nearby to rent. Opening night was Saturday, July 16, 1949. The theater played the color film Barclays of Broadway, featuring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. It was a near sellout, close to 1,000 cars. Rather than rest on his laurels, Singrini parlayed the success of the Dennis Drive-In to a second theater planned near the Mashpee Rotary in 1950. These plans never materialized, though. Cape Cod had to wait 6 years for a second drive-in theater to open. It was in the 1950s that the drive-in hit its apex as an entertainment attraction. This was the case on Cape Cod as well. Herman Rifkin opened the Cod Drive-In in the T-Ticket section of Falmouth in 1955. This was followed quickly by the Hyannis Drive-In on Route 132, the Yarmouth Drive-In on Route 28, followed in 1956, and finally, the Wellfleet Drive-In was built on Route 6 in 1957. This brought the total to 5 drive-ins on Cape Cod. In 1958, the total number of drive-in theaters in the United States hit its high of 4,063. The drive-in had continued success throughout the 60s and into the 70s. However, the tide slowly began to turn. An increase in land values, the advent of VCRs, and the fact that drive-in shows had to begin late with summer sunset times started to eat into business. By 1980, there were just over 2,000 drive-ins left. The 1980s saw the virtual end of the industry on Cape Cod. It began in 1980 when the Cod Drive-In in Falmouth closed. The land just off of Route 28 was owned for years by the Augusta family, who owned the abutting Falmouth Lumber. In the spring of 2003, a 23.7-acre parcel of the former drive-in land was purchased by the town of Falmouth. As of this recording, though, nothing has been done with that property. Next to close was the Dennis Drive-In in 1984. The property was to be turned into a housing subdivision. However, again, as of this recording, much of the property remains overgrown. And if you go walking through those former grounds, you can find chunks of asphalt, concrete, former speaker stands, and wire littered about. And yes, I know from proof I have gone on those grounds. The Yarmouth Drive-In that I was most familiar with initially closed in 1985. Throughout the years, many ideas were bandied about as what should become of the 22-acre site. A river walk consisting of trails and boardwalks leading along neighboring Parker's River out to Seagull Beach had potential but yet has never materialized. The COVID pandemic kind of resurrected the Yarmouth Drive-In. In July 2020, it was resurrected by Innovation, Arts, and Entertainment. The new Yarmouth Drive-In was updated for the 21st century with bright LED screens, which made daytime movies possible. But as of this recording, that appears to have been just a one-summer deal, because those grounds have been barren the 2 summers since. In 1987, the Hyannis Drive-In became the 4th to close on the Cape in 7 years. Though religious services took place on the grounds for a short time afterwards, the property would eventually become home to Stop and Shop. It was also in 1987 where the total number of drive-ins dipped below 1,000 nationwide. The Wellfleet Drive-In for more than 30 years stood tall as the last beacon of a bygone era. It became a popular summer destination for those wishing for a slice of 1950s nostalgia in a 21st century world. And as of this recording, it still remains a perfect family night out in the summer. It's still going strong. The drive-in theater for a time was the place to see new movies. It became as much a part of pop culture of a bygone generation as the movies themselves did. Though their numbers massively dwindled as the decades passed, the drive-in is not finished yet. In a time where social distancing is still kind of normal, there is a potential for a comeback of these beloved old-school icons. But to circle all the way back around, what became of Richard Hollingshead's original Camden Drive-In? Partially due to the high movie rental costs and lower than expected crowds, Hollingshead sold his theater less than 3 years after opening it to a man who moved the business to Union, New Jersey, and it did not ever reopen. The final insult came when Hollingshead's company was sued in 1950 and he lost his patent on some of the designs of the drive-in, and not surprisingly, the large rush of new theaters came shortly thereafter. But what about everybody out there? Did you have a favorite drive-in theater you used to go to as a kid? Are you too young to really remember when they were a big deal? I never went to the Cod Drive-In in Falmouth or the Dennis Drive-In when they were open. I remember the Hyannis Drive-In's grounds right after they had closed down. And the Yarmouth Drive-In I went to so many times as a kid. I remember seeing E.T., Return of the Jedi, Flash Gordon. My mother said at the time it was cheaper to bring kids there to get them to go to sleep than it was to hire a babysitter and go out and have fun as an adult. But what are your memories of Cape Cod drive-ins or drive-ins in general? Let me know and we can compare notes on our stories of visiting these former old school giants, the drive-in. Over the years, I've done so many different road trips when it comes to photography that when I put together these segments for the podcast, I typically have a pretty good idea of what I want to talk about and the places that I want to share with you. But doing so many road trips, there are stories and places that I totally forget about until I start putting together my notes. And that's the deal with this week's road trip to Bristol, Rhode Island, where it's going to dive into a funny story about a race that I ran. Bristol itself, it's a medium-sized town. As of 2020, the population was just over 22,000. And for those of you looking to go and visit it, it's pretty centrally located from anywhere in most of New England. It's about 65 miles south of Boston, about 90 miles east of Hartford, Connecticut, And being that Rhode Island is the size of a postage stamp, you can get there from anywhere. It's a hop, skip, and a jump, as they say. Bristol is bordered by both Narragansett Bay and Mount Hope Bay, and it is every bit a quintessential New England town. Now, I suppose that all differs depending on where you live and what you like, but quintessential New England, you think of beautiful waterfront views. Maybe if you live up in northern New England, in New Hampshire and Vermont, you think of mountains and wide open green. But if you go drive through Bristol, I think you would agree it's quintessential New England. It does have its share of higher learning, though, as Bristol is home to Roger Williams University. It was founded in 1956, and it's named for the state of Rhode Island co-founder and theologian Roger Williams. They typically have about 5,000 students there per semester. What's interesting to me is that the first time I ever went to Bristol, I wanted to go to the Mount Hope Bridge, which connects Bristol from Portsmouth, Rhode Island. It's a beautiful bridge. It reminds me of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. The suspension bridge goes just over 1,200 feet across Narragansett Bay. The bridge was first opened in 1929, and it's a part of Route 114, so if you're driving that road through Rhode Island, you'll have to go over the bridge. But the funny thing is, when I first went there, I didn't know that there's an actual parking area under the bridge, kind of at the foot of the bridge. So I parked at Roger Williams University, probably taking a student spot, and walked all the way over there. It's only a couple of 100 yards, but still, I was glad I didn't get ticketed, since I was clearly not a student. But in addition to the beautiful pictures of the bridge from kind of underneath it, spanning away from you, there's a hidden gem underneath the bridge, and that's Bristol Ferry Lighthouse. That's right, there's a lighthouse underneath the bridge. The lighthouse was built in 1855, so long before the bridge was there. And I guess it made more sense to just leave that lighthouse underneath there than to move it somewhere. So if you go to park and look at the bridge and get photos of it, you'd be surprised to see this little lighthouse almost directly underneath it. If you drove over the bridge, you'd never see it. The lighthouse is on private property. You can get really close to it, and it was also discontinued once the bridge was started. But still, it's a fascinating little hidden gem. A beautiful spot that is definitely not hidden is the 127-acre Mount Hope Farm. It's at 250 Metacom Avenue. It's right near Roger Williams University and only a couple of minutes from downtown Bristol, which makes it even more of a unique attraction because there's a college, there's a downtown, and then there's this wide open farm that's also a bed and breakfast. Check out mounthopefarm.org to get pictures, more information about what you can see and do there. You can always just go during daylight hours and walk the trails, check out the historic buildings, and just enjoy the scenery. But if you want to stay there, the Governor Bradford home, which is the main home, they have rooms. North Pasture and South Pasture are the other buildings where you can go and you can check on their website and see availability. They also hold events there. They're popular for weddings. They've got an arboretum. They've got goats, sheep, and donkeys that you can check out, but don't feed them. It's just this beautiful throwback, wide open green. Even though Bristol's not a big city, it still feels like a little bit of an escape. So sure, you can go to Bristol for a day trip, but spending more time there, a couple of days, is even better. If you don't want to stay at the Mount Hope Farm, you can stay at Williams Grant Inn, which is a highly decorated bed and breakfast. They're located at 154 High Street and also williamsgrantinn.com. The home itself is colonial federal style, built in 1808. It's red, white, and blue, but the blue is kind of periwinkle. It's a beautiful setup right near downtown. They've got all the typical amenities, breakfast, Wi-Fi, but they also have a beautiful garden, a barbecue area. There's a reason they're highly rated. And if you're staying in Bristol and you want to go get something to eat, you can definitely enjoy yourself at Pomodoro Pizzeria. They're at 271 Wood Street and also pomodorobristol.com. It's classic Italian food and pizza, kind of rustic decor, but also outdoor seating. They do catering as well. So if you're having an event at Mount Hope Farm, maybe you get Pomodoro to cater it. Classics, lasagna, meatballs, piccata, caprese, salads. If you're not in the mood for Italian, though, you can check out The Lobster Pot at 119 Hope Street. They've got lunch, dinner, and cocktails right on the water. I checked. I don't believe they're any relation to the Lobster Pot in Provincetown, but they are just as famous. So it's interesting that two different places have that name, and they're both super beloved and well-regarded where they're at. Visit lobsterpotri.com, and you can get a better sense of them, see the menus, pictures of the food, pictures of outside. But there's one last place I wanted to share in Bristol, and that has to do with a funny race story. Colt State Park is on Route 114 in Bristol. It's over 460 acres of these beautiful sweeping views of the water and through the forest. I went there many years ago, and I ran the Colt State Park 5K race. And if you're not familiar with running and races and times and such, for a 5K, a big goal is to break 20 minutes, to run the 5K 3.1 miles in less than 20 minutes. At the time I ran that race, I had not done it yet, so that was my big plan. Being that it was, I believe, the end of June, it was bug season. The race was later in the day because typically they have summertime races either first thing in the morning or late in the evening to kind of avoid the heat. They don't want you to drop dead running their race. Being that I also don't really have any hair because my hair I just don't enjoy, I had to be prepared for the race, which means I had to have sunscreen. But then being that it was going to be bugs, I also had to have bug spray. So I got to the race early like I always do, and I soaked myself in sunscreen and bug spray and figured I had all of that covered because it was a pretty warm evening. The race was 2 laps, so a little over 1.5 miles each time. You went through the woods a lot. It was a lot of trail running, which I didn't know. When you came around for the first lap, you could see your time and kind of figure out what you needed to do to meet your goal, whether that was sub 20 minutes like mine. During that first lap, I started obviously sweating in the heat, so I had bug spray and sunscreen running down into my eyes, into my mouth. And you know how much that burns. It made my lips tingling from the bug spray. And I'm trying to run and wipe this out of my eyes, and I'm just making like the raspberries noise, trying to get the bug spray off my lips and tongue. My time was still good after that first lap, but I was blinded. And going around the second time, the trail runs, I landed on a couple of roots, ended up really wrecking both my ankles. I ended up with a good time. I did not break 20 minutes, but by the end, I was just blind with sore ankles. And that was one of those stories that only when I started putting together the itinerary for this segment of the podcast did I remember that Colt State Park race. And I wanted to share the embarrassment of the bug spray and sunscreen and busting up my ankles. But Colt State Park is beautiful to visit. You don't have to go run a race to be there. Visit eastbaychamberri.org. That's the Chamber of Commerce for Bristol and the surrounding area. You can get a better idea of what to see, what to do, where to stay. But it's so close to a lot of places. Most of Massachusetts, all of Rhode Island, most of Connecticut, southern Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. You can all go and visit Bristol, Rhode Island. And if you're coming from further, just spend the night. It'll be worth it. And I'll be back next week with a brand new road trip, likely without the embarrassing race extracurriculars, but hey, you never know. This week in history, we are going back 121 years ago, September 6th, 1901, and the shooting of President William McKinley. McKinley was a speaker and honored guest at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. This was a World's Fair. It lasted from May to the first week of November. It was 350 acres of buildings and attractions. A lot of it was centered around electricity and electric power. But President McKinley was there, and he did a couple of speeches, including the day before, September 5th, where he had 116,000 people there to hear him speak. And then later in the evening, there were patriotic fireworks. But it was the next day when he was shaking hands with well-wishers. A man named Leon Solgals, who was a 28-year-old anarchist, was near the front of the line with a .32 caliber revolver wrapped in a white handkerchief around his hand, so it looked like he had a broken hand or some kind of injury. Interestingly, there had been added police and security because of fears of an assassin, and some of McKinley's staff had even wanted him to cancel this event, it began at 4 in the evening. And when McKinley went to shake Zolgal's hand, he raised the gun and fired 2 shots right in his abdomen at point-blank range. The crowd was able to subdue him before he could get a third shot off, and they beat the living hell out of him. It actually was McKinley who told them to stop. At first, it appeared that McKinley might have gotten lucky. One of the bullets hit a button on his coat, so it caused minor damage. The second one went right through his stomach, though. And at the World's Fair, the only doctor qualified they could find was a gynecologist who couldn't really do much for surgery. Days after the shooting, updates came out. It appeared that everything was going to be okay, that he was going to recover. His vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, was so confident he took off on a hunting trip. Sadly, though, by September 13th, McKinley had gangrene from blood poisoning in his stomach. McKinley ultimately passed away 2:15 a.m. on September 14th, 1901. Becoming the third president in 36 years to be assassinated in America after Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. There was a tremendous outpouring of grief for McKinley, but over time he ended up getting really overshadowed by Theodore Roosevelt, who ended up becoming one of the most beloved and well-known presidents in history. But that fateful day where President William McKinley was mortally wounded at the Buffalo Pan Am Exposition occurred 121 years ago this week in history. And now it's time for a brand new time capsule. We're going to go back 70 years ago this week to September 8th, 1952. Let's see what was going on in the world of pop culture back then. The number one song was Auf Wiedersehen, Sweetheart by Vera Lynn. The song was originally written in 1950 by German composer Eberhard Storch for his wife, Maria, who had been really ill in the hospital. Vera Lynn recorded it in English in 1952. It spent 9 weeks at number one in America, and interestingly, Vera Lynn became the first foreign act to have a song go number one in America because she was English from England. That record of 9 weeks at number one for a British song would stand until the Beatles' Hey Jude tied it in 1968. The number one movie was Monkey Business. This was a comedy starring Cary Grant, Ginger Rogers, and Marilyn Monroe about a chemist whose life is turned upside down when one of his chimpanzees finds the fountain of youth. It's 85% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, and if you wanted to get in to see the movie back then, a ticket would cost you 53 cents. I couldn't find any box office numbers for this movie, but I did find that it made $2 million in video rentals. I have no idea what that means as of what time, what year this money was made. But I'd feel pretty confident saying that any movie with Cary Grant, Ginger Rogers, and Marilyn Monroe was probably a pretty big hit. Thus why it was number one. And finally, the number one TV show was Dragnet. The original series, which was based on the radio show of the same name, was a police show, with the Dragnet name being a police term for a series of coordinated moves to help you catch criminals. It starred Jack Webb and Ben Alexander, and the original series lasted 8 years, from 1951 to 1959, and a total of 276 episodes. There was also a revival in the late 1960s and 3 movies based on the show, including a 1987 one that starred Dan Aykroyd and Tom Hanks as Friday and Strebeck. And if you're around back then, 70 years ago, this week in history, celebrating those last moments of summer, you want to go hang out at the beach? Well, you're in luck. You can bring your own portable radio with you, but you also don't want to spend a lot of money on a portable radio that's going to get full of sand. So the lowest priced portable radio from Sears, plastic, with a built-in B battery and 2 flashlight A batteries, would only cost you $15.95, or about $178 when adjusted for inflation. And it's battery-powered and plastic, and it only got local standard AM radio. I don't know how far the antenna went, but this was the best deal I could find on a portable radio back then. You could, of course, spend a lot more money, but I'm trying to save you money from 70 years ago. That's going to wrap up another This Week in History, another time capsule. Now it's time for a brand new top 5. This is going to be a fun one to go over. It's the top 5 brand names that are more synonymous with their product than the product themselves. What does that mean? Well, let me explain it as we dive into it right now. Okay, so what exactly am I talking about when I mean brand names that are more famous than the product themselves? It's basically any brand that has become so well established and synonymous with whatever it is they sell that people almost use that interchangeable with the product. And it's fun to go over these because then you'll see where you probably, with at least one of these, use the name of the brand to describe the product. Let me dive into some honorable mentions that'll kind of give a better idea of what I'm talking about. Some of these brands that are more well-known than the product themselves. Honorable mentions include Tupperware, Ziploc, Xerox, Saran Wrap, and Popsicle. You all know what all of those are, but those are the brand names. They don't describe what exactly the product is, but I bet you have used at least one of those names to describe the product, even though it might not be that. Hell, I bet everyone calls any frozen treat on a stick a popsicle, even though popsicle is an actual brand name. I mean, my Nana used to call any video game system Nintendo because it was more well-known to her than the concept of video games and video game systems. That's just an example from my life. But let's jump into the actual top 5. These are in no particular order, so let's start off with number 1, Kleenex. Kleenex is a brand of facial tissue, but I'm sure a lot of people just say Kleenex and tissue like they're the same thing. The Kleenex brand has been around for 98 years, since 1924, so it's easy to see where it could become a part of English language. But nope, Kleenex is a brand registered to the Kimberly-Clark Company. They make facial tissues, toilet paper, diapers, paper towels, and more. Interestingly, Kleenex's first product was crepe paper for gas masks in World War I, and this product was adapted a little bit after the war and became known as Kotex, which is a product women know all too well when dealing with their periods. That's a little fun fact. Number 2 is Frisbee, also known as a flying disc. The idea of the flying disc or gliding disc started in 1937 when Walter Frederick Morrison and his future wife had fun throwing a popcorn lid back and forth. It was originally named the Flying Saucer to capitalize on the UFO craze of the late 1940s and early 50s. Morrison eventually sold the rights to his flying disc to the Wham-O Company in 1957. They renamed the disc Frisbee, and the rest is history. I am sure some of you out there, any flying disc you see, you call a Frisbee. I know I do. And why not? There's been well over 300 million Frisbees sold since they became Frisbees in 1957. Number 3 is Band-Aid. These are adhesive bandages, and they were invented in 1920 by a Johnson & Johnson employee named Early Dickinson for his wife Josephine, who frequently burned or cut herself cooking. Band-Aid was my exhibit A when I was thinking of these brand names synonymous with the product. It's more commonly known as a generic trademark or a genericized trademark, where because of the popularity of a product, it becomes more synonymous with the product itself. Number 4 is the Q-tip. These are cotton swabs, typically used for getting wax out of your ears. The first mass-produced cotton swab was by Leo Gerstenzang, who watched his wife put cotton balls on toothpicks to clean their baby's ears, which sounds really dangerous. These were first developed in 1923, and eventually when they got the name Q-tip, the Q stood for quality. So there's another little-known fact. The Q-tip brand is currently owned by a company named Unilever, and I've saved the best for last, number 5. This just made me laugh because I couldn't believe it was real. Number 5 on the countdown of brand names synonymous with their product is the Dumpster. Yes, the Dumpster is an actual brand name. It is a mobile garbage bin is what a dumpster is known as. The word dumpster was patented in 1935 by the Dempster brothers, George, Thomas, and John, who were based out of Knoxville, Tennessee. It combined the brothers' Dempster name with the word dump, where they would take the trash. And that word dumpster had 3 different trademarks with it, including the Dempster Dump Master, which was the first real popular front-loading garbage truck. But if you're in America and you see one of these trash bins, what do you call them? A dumpster, typically. So I was shocked to find out that the word dumpster was actually a registered trademark. That was kind of the genesis of this whole segment, was that fact I wanted to get to and save it till the end. But which of these do you use interchangeably with the product themselves? Kleenex, Frisbee, Band-Aid, Q-tip, or dumpster? Did any of these surprise you? The only other one besides dumpster that surprised me was popsicle. But that'll wrap up the top 5. I'll be back next week with another top 5 that'll be just as random and hopefully just as fun and educational as this one was. CDs for a penny, cassette tapes for a penny, records for a penny. If you were a kid growing up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you saw the ads for Columbia House records. They were in so many magazines geared towards younger adults. Today, with the advent of streaming, with digital media, Spotify, Pandora, MP3s, the need for physical copies of compact discs, vinyl albums, cassette tapes, it's not really necessary. It's more of a niche thing now. Some people that are my age and older are starting to collect vinyl as a hobby. But there was a time, going back 20 years or more ago, that Columbia House was a big deal. You'd see their advertisement in whatever magazine it was. There would be at least several dozen, probably closer to between 100 and 200 titles that you could choose from. For me, when it was CDs, it was 8 for a penny. Sometimes it was 10 or 12 for a penny. And oh yeah, I did Columbia House. I think I did it once. I think that was it. Because you couldn't beat that deal, especially if you're a kid at high school or college and you don't have tons of money. I don't remember the number that I got. Let's just say it was 10 CDs for a penny. I think you paid the shipping. You got to pick out the numbers. You write it. There's a little box in the corner of the advertisement. So you obviously put your address down there. Pick out your 10 free titles and send it off. Within a few weeks, you got a box with the CDs in it, and everything was great, or so you thought. Because obviously, getting those CDs for free, there was a catch. They weren't just that kind and generous. The thing was, you had a membership that came with it. And here was the trick with this membership, was that you got your 10 CDs or whatever for a penny. And then every so often, I don't remember if it was monthly, you would get sent another CD. I don't think it was random. I think it was kind of based around what you got, musical taste-wise. But the main thing was, as long as you did not tell them to not send it, they would send it. So it all hinged on you remembering to cancel. And if you got the CD in the mail, then suddenly the price was more akin to what you would pay in a record store. $17, $18 for a CD plus shipping. I'm sure there were loads of parents that had to get in touch with Columbia House to get their kids out of these memberships that they signed up for. But let's take a look at Columbia House as a company overall. By the time I got my foray into 10 CDs for a penny, Columbia House was owned by Sony, and I think the other company was BMG. But Columbia House has roots that go all the way back to 1955, and it was vinyl records via mail order. That's their whole business model, mail order music. And like I said at the top of this, as the times went along and vinyl was replaced by 8 tracks, replaced by cassette tapes, replaced by compact discs, they just adapted their model. And this model worked for decades, where you get your certain amount of music for a penny, and then you're obligated to get music going forward at a marked up price. Like I said, the CDs were $17, $18. I could have gone locally to Newbury Comics or Spinnaker's in Hyannis and get the same CD for $11, $12. So how could Columbia House sell all these CDs for a penny to rope you in? Well, it turns out they had these multi-million-dollar contracts with the big music recording companies. So what would end up happening was they would get the cover art and the actual music master tape, the raw music, and they'd make their own CDs, cassettes, whatever, and save themselves money there. But then when it came time for the membership for you, they would supremely overcharge you. The peak for Columbia House was ironically when I had my foray into dealing with them. That was 1996 was their top year. And their revenue that year was $1.4 billion. So that's way more than CDs for a penny. That's a lot of people that got hooked into the overpriced CDs. In doing some research for this segment, I learned a lot of interesting stuff about Columbia House and how they were able to survive for decades with kind of a shoddy business model. One was the fact that they made their own CDs and cassettes meant that the audio quality was not as good as what you would get through the actual music company that put out the music. I laughed. I thought of it as, rather than buying cassette singles, the cassingles back in the early 90s, it would be like if I took my little radio and recorded a song off of the radio station where it's slightly degraded audio. That's kind of what Columbia House was. And for example, the CDs would roughly cost Columbia House like $1.50 to make with the materials, but then there were no royalty payments paid towards the musical artists. So you were paying them for the CDs, but then the artists weren't getting any money. It was almost like Napster. And of course, as I've said, the business model of the subscription and you getting a CD or a cassette at a designated period of time, supremely marked up, sometimes not music that you're even interested in. That, I'm sure, netted them a lot of money, but it also netted them a lot of negative reviews and people that didn't want to deal with that, even for 10 free CDs or whatever the number was. I know that I was able to get out of this contract. I think I got 1 or 2 CDs from them at the regular price, and then it was over. But I've heard of really aggressive collection agencies coming after people for their unpaid bills to Columbia House. what Columbia House banked on was something called a negative option, which is basically the idea of hooking people in with a great introductory deal. Once that part of the deal is up, then you get stuck with a contract that is really more favorable towards the company. I read this NPR.com article about the history of Columbia House, and they interviewed a guy that worked for them in the late 1990s, and he's the one that talked about the negative option. So that's coming straight from people that worked there. So it's not that they were totally dishonest, but it's just that the truth of their statement was really small fine print. And your eyes, especially if you're a kid, high school, college, and you see all these CDs that you get to choose from, like being a kid in a candy store, that's what you're distracted by. Oh, I can get 10 of these for a penny, and you don't see the fine print, which is we own your soul for the next 3 years buying super expensive CDs. By the mid to late 90s, that was when AOL took over as the biggest mail order marketing company, sending you all the CDs for free hours of internet. And then digital music came along, which really killed Columbia House. Their revenue went from $1.4 billion in 1996, like I said, down to just $17 million in 2014. And that's when they were starting to do DVDs by mail. But the Columbia House model, it's still around, where you get even Spotify, Pandora, we'll give you a free month, and then after that, it's only $5 a month or $9.99 a month. And the thing is, you have to remember to cancel, or else it just rolls over. And that's sort of the Columbia House model seen in the 2020s. But despite its somewhat negative reputation for how they suckered young people into these subscription contracts and then their aggressive bill collecting, Columbia House was definitely a rite of passage for kids 70s, 80s, 90s to be able to pick out the music you wanted and get it shipped to you for a reasonable price to start. Did you ever get cassettes, 8-tracks, records, CDs through Columbia House? Did you have any bad experiences with bill collectors from them? It feels like it wasn't long ago, but it definitely was long ago. When you would open a magazine, write in your 8, 10, 12 CD titles you wanted, send it off with your address, and get a box in the mail in a few weeks, and then a box full of headaches for the next few weeks, months, years after that. Good old Columbia House. That'll wrap up episode 84 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Thank you so much to everyone who's been tuning in. I always say it, I can't do this without people listening and supporting the podcast, sharing it, leaving reviews, donating if you want, buy me a coffee. You don't have to, but if you want to, go to buymeacoffee.com, find the In My Footsteps podcast. Anything I get through there, I use to advertise the podcast, so it's just reinvesting in this. Find me all over social media, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, the In My Footsteps podcast blog, which is chock full of Cape Cod history, travel, lifestyle stuff. It's the only place where I have new Cape Cod history articles. If you see anything of mine out there on another website, they're just recycling my stuff after not writing for them for 3 years. I won't even name names because they're kind of lame how they recycle an article repeatedly, and I only got paid for it once. But I digress. If you ever have any questions, comments, shoot me an email, christophersutherland@gmail.com. If you ever have any ideas of things you may want to hear about on the podcast, you can always shoot me an email. As you've heard, I've had a few that have been requested that have been good. I've had fun researching them. But if you just want to go with the flow, I've got so many topics coming up, so these podcasts will be loaded going forward. Fall is just around the corner. If you're looking for homemade, handmade, beautifully crafted gifts for holidays, birthdays, check out Kiwi's Customs on Etsy.com. It's all the brainchild of Kaylee Marks, who is supremely talented and honing her craft, developing her skills, Go to the site. It costs nothing to look and see what she is capable of. Dog and cat sweaters, fairy hats, baklavas, there's jewelry. And she takes requests. If it's something that's in her wheelhouse that she's capable of, she's always listening and she's always willing to do things like that for people that patronize her business. So visit Kiwi's Customs, both spelled with K's, at Etsy.com. You'll be amazed at the beautiful work she puts in. I'm amazed but not surprised at the talent that she has. So check out Kiwi's Customs. As for my bread and butter, the podcast, next week is episode 85. We're going to look back at one of my favorite places, one of my favorite pieces of Cape Cod history, and that's the Marconi site in Wellfleet. We're going to take a road trip up north, for me at least, to the town of Rutland, Vermont. We're going to go way, way back in the day and look at what it was like during the heyday of video arcades. There'll be a brand new top 5, and these are going to be the top 5 worst as seen on TV products. I did the funniest before. This is the worst, and I looked at ratings, so you're going to get the worst of the worst. And of course, there'll be a brand new This Week in History and Time Capsule, all coming up next week on episode 85 of the In My Footsteps podcast. But like I said, fall is on its way. My favorite time of year has begun, so my mental health, I feel, is going to take a huge leap forward. But if you're struggling out there with your own mental health, if you've hit a roadblock, a speed bump, remember to lean into the things that make you happy. Whether it's a specific YouTube channel, a specific food, a place you like to go, and make time for the people that care for you. Get that good feeling going back through your body. Because life is a long and winding road with a lot of ups and downs. And a lot of it is navigating the lows while enjoying the highs as much as you can. Sometimes I say these things and think to myself, yeah, you better follow your own advice too. But hey, we're all doing the best we can. And remember, in this life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps. Create your own path and enjoy every moment you can on this journey. Leave the biggest footprint in this world that you can. Thank you all again for tuning in. This has been the In My Footsteps podcast. I have been Christopher Setterland, and I will talk to you all again soon.